Why on earth would someone compare a Colleen Hoover adaptation and the sequel to Knives Out? Well, despite being in two completely different genres, they both raise the same question. When is it okay for a movie to lie to its audience? For a large portion of their runtimes, Glass Onion and It Ends With Us both try to deceive the viewer. They start off making you believe that the movie is about one thing, before pulling the rug out from underneath you and revealing that something much more sinister is actually going on. But not all lies are created equal. In my opinion, there are three critical elements that make for a satisfying cinematic misdirection. And while Glass Onion contains all of these, It Ends With Us struggles to include any of them. Hence, why I think these movies are worth comparing. So grab your friends, wear your florals, and let's figure out the right way to lie to your audience. Before we begin, we need to establish what truth each movie is trying to hide from us. In It Ends With Us, the movie starts off pretending to be a contemporary romance, but is actually a story about domestic violence. Like Lily, the audience is meant to be invested in her romance with Ryle and brush over some of the red flags we see early in their relationship.
This is Atlas. Almost one you wasted your virginity on?
When Ryle hits her at the midpoint of the movie, claiming that it was an accident, the rest of the narrative focuses on Lily admitting to herself that she's in an abusive relationship. The sudden change in tone and direction is meant to capture what it feels like to be in denial about your abusive partner, and how abuse can escalate in subtle ways that make it difficult to notice. In Glass Onion, there isn't nearly as much of a tonal shift, but the plot still changes quite drastically at the midpoint. The movie starts off with Benoit Blanc being invited to a murder mystery weekend hosted by Miles Braun. There, it's revealed that each of the other guests has a reason to harm Miles, and that he doesn't know who invited Blanc to the island. That night, Duke gets poisoned and Andy gets shot. We then flash back to several days prior, where it's revealed that Andy actually died in what appeared to be a suicide. Suspecting foul play, Andy's twin sister Helen recruits Blanc to investigate Miles and the Disruptors, all of whom are former associates of Andy who helped push her out of the company she founded. Pretending to be Andy, Helen and Blanc were actually investigating for clues during the first half of the movie. After snooping around,
Snoop.
they figure out that Miles is responsible for the deaths of both Andy and Duke. The reason for the sudden shift at the midpoint is because the truth was hiding in plain sight all along. The audience doesn't pay attention to obvious clues in the first half because they assume the mystery is complicated.
It's so dumb, it's brilliant.
No! It's just dumb!
Much like how the audience assumes Miles couldn't have done it because he's too obvious of a suspect.
What if he just did it?
Miles Braun is not an idiot.
Miles Braun is an idiot.
Now, in concept, both of these subversions are equally valid, but the problem lies in their execution. The first critical element of misdirection in a movie is camera perspective. More often than not, the camera takes on a relatively neutral position within a narrative. There may be some slight biases, like framing Jack Sparrow heroically, or making Darth Vader look like an unstoppable monster. But overall, the camera depicts events objectively. If you see something happen on screen, that's really how it happened within the world of the narrative. In some movies, though, the camera takes on the perspective of one of the characters. In 2019's Joker, the audience can't be sure what they're seeing is real because the whole movie is from Arthur's point of view. In reality, whole sequences might have played out differently or have never even happened. Theoretically, this is what It Ends With Us is trying to go for. It even tries to warn us that Lily might not be a reliable narrator.
I'm not sure I'm an unreliable narrator.
But this doesn't work nearly as well as the movie thinks it does. First of all, the cinematography never establishes that we're seeing things from Lily's perspective. The camera work is fine, don't get me wrong, but it's relatively standard for a modern romance. There's almost no stylization that would suggest that what we're seeing isn't objective, and the characters are all given equal significance when they're on screen. For instance, this shot of the main character makes us feel intimately in tune with her emotions, but so does this shot of her best friend. When she's chasing after Ryle in this shot, Lily is not the most prominent person in frame, making it feel like we are seeing things from her partner's partner's perspective rather than her own. This is a big problem because the whole reveal that Ryle is physically abusive only works if we initially see the events from the perspective of someone in denial. In the original novel, Colleen Hoover wrote the story in first-person present, which meant that we were literally experiencing the world through Lily's eyes and mind. The story is therefore inherently subjective, since she can only narrate her personal experience. But the cinematography in the film adaptation feels like the cinematic equivalent of third-person narration. So, in the first scene depicting DV, when the camera and editing makes it appear that Ryle accidentally hit her after burning his hand, it feels like we should take this as the objective truth. The only shots that feel highly subjective in this sequence are these two, which occur after the physical incident. As a result, it seemed like the movie wanted to communicate that the event was an accident, but that it triggered a trauma response because Lily's father had a history of abusing her mom.
I heard what happened last night with your dad and your mom.
Revealing that it was abuse on Ryle's part winds up feeling like the camera flat out lied to the viewer rather than the protagonist lying to herself. By contrast, I think the stair sequence does a much better job at establishing a subjective point of view. When Ryle finds out that Lily is still in contact with her first love, Atlas, he storms out of the apartment and into the stairwell. When Lily runs after him, the camera makes it ambiguous whether Lily tripped or was pushed by her partner. Then, when she wakes up, we literally see things from her perspective. When Ryle tells her,
You fell down the stairs.
and convinces her that he's
Helping me.
the audience feels exactly as Lily does in that moment. We're disoriented, we're afraid, we want to believe that Ryle is a good guy, but we know something's not right. The camera, dialogue, and sound design all come together in a way that grounds us in Lily's point of view. It's a brilliantly executed sequence, but it also exemplifies what the other 90% of the movie is missing. It feels like the cinematography is only interested in empathizing with Lily when terrible things are happening to her, which in my opinion is kind of exploitative. Plenty of bad stuff happens to Arthur and Joker, but the camera is just as connected to him when he's having a nice moment with a kid on the bus. If It Ends With Us wanted to be emotionally raw and subjective, it needed to establish a consistent visual language and see everything through Lily's perspective, not just her trauma. Ironically, Glass Onion is far more objective in its camera work, but still manages effective sequences of subjectivity. For most of the movie, what you see is what you get, which is kind of the whole point.
I like the glass onion as a metaphor. An object that seems densely layered, but in reality, the center is in plain sight.
The movie might not show you something important, like that Andy is Helen or that she's working with Benoit, but it almost never lies to you. The only moment where the camera shows us something that didn't actually happen is when Miles tells everybody that Duke picked up his glass.
He picked up mine.
And you might think that this counts as the movie cheating, but it's actually okay for two reasons. Reason number one, if you look closely when it originally happens, you can actually spot the truth.
Look at that dress spin. Birdie, that's amazing. Just
Duke reaches for his own glass, but Miles tricks him into picking up the other one. Reason number two, the movie actually sets up why the camera is lying to us. Miles is trying to deceive Benoit, and by extension the audience, meaning that this clip represents the lie that he wants us to believe. It's a great example of what's called the Rashomon effect, which is named after the famous Kurosawa movie, in which each character gives a unique and often contradictory account of a samurai's murder. It's totally okay for the camera to outright trick the audience, but the filmmakers have to have a good reason for doing so and make sure it's properly set up within the narrative. If we apply this lesson to It Ends With Us, they should have just given Lily a few lines of voiceover scattered throughout the movie. This way, despite the largely objective camera work, we'd firmly establish Lily as the narrator, making the subjective bits feel motivated, even if their use is inconsistent. The next element needed for satisfying misdirection is strong thematic structure. If the real plot doesn't kick off until the halfway point, your movie needs to at least be developing the central themes from the very beginning. And if we look at Glass Onion, it does this quite literally. The main theme of Glass Onion is that people will often ignore the obvious but unsettling truth because convoluted lies are often more comforting. And if we're getting real specific, it's about how many people overlook the obvious shortcomings of tech billionaires like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg because we want to believe that only only competent, rational people can be that successful. Looking at the opening sequence, we see the Disruptors, who all worship Miles Braun, go through each convoluted step of opening the mystery box. Helen, however, is disillusioned with Miles, and therefore takes the simplest approach to finding out what's inside. So, even if we don't know about the movie's main mystery until the midpoint, the film is already supporting its central theme. This continues throughout the first hour, with the characters having multiple conversations that deal with the film's central thesis. Miles, for instance, makes it sound like he's intelligent and knows what he's talking about,
Because you're busting up something that everyone wanted broken in the first place. That's the infraction point.
but on closer inspection, what he's saying doesn't actually make sense.
A veritable minefield of malapropisms.
Even if the audience doesn't know it on the first viewing, everything that happens in the first half is critical to the film's mystery and message. Admittedly, this does make for a much slower start to the movie. Unlike Knives Out, which begins with a bang and subverts the genre at the end of Act 1 instead of the midpoint, Glass Onion can feel like it lacks direction for much of the runtime. But this is sort of inherent to movies that obfuscate what they're really about. And from an artistic standpoint, it's flawlessly executed. It Ends With Us has a similar plot structure as Glass Onion in that it reveals its true nature at the midpoint, but unfortunately, its thematic structure is much less effective. The main theme of It Ends With Us is that it takes immense courage to recognize an abusive relationship, and even greater courage to break free of the cycle. In fact, the title is a promise Lily makes to her daughter about this very issue.
Yeah, stops right here, Bubba, with you and me. It ends with us.
The problem, however, is that the movie doesn't meaningfully explore this theme for the majority of the runtime. Because the screenplay wants Ryle's abuse to be a surprise, the only time the movie brings up domestic violence before the midpoint is during the flashbacks. We learn that Atlas's mom tends to date abusive men.
She likes dating guys that beat the
We briefly see Lily's dad attack her mom, and he almost kills Atlas when he catches him in his daughter's bedroom. Even though these scenes talk about domestic violence, they aren't saying anything meaningful. Lily's dad is used as a source of tension.
That's my dad. That is my dad. You have to go.
But the movie doesn't do much to explore her relationship with him or how it makes her feel about her mom. What I think the film doesn't understand is that there's a difference between depicting something on screen and examining it critically. There's a single moment at the end of the movie where Lily asks her mom,
Why did you stay with him?
and her mom says,
It would have been harder to leave, and I loved him.
which is a deeply profound moment for both characters. But it's the only time where the film actually discusses why the cycle of abuse is so difficult to break. An easy way to improve the thematic structure would be for Lily to have more conversations like this throughout the movie. Lily could believe that she would never tolerate an abusive partner and bear some resentment towards her mom for not leaving her dad. When she finally realizes that Ryle is abusive, she would truly understand what her mom was going through. This would be when Lily realizes she too is part of the cycle, making it that much more poignant when she promises to break free for the sake of her daughter. As it stands, the movie shoots itself in the foot by trying to hide its real subject matter. It's so worried that you might guess the twist that it refuses to meaningfully explore its own themes for most of the runtime. To put this into perspective, Colleen Hoover prefaces the book with a dedication that reads, "For my father, who tried his very best not to be his worst, and for my mother, who made sure we never saw him at his worst." With just 2 lines, Hoover gives a more nuanced insight into an abusive family dynamic than the movie does in all the flashbacks combined. What makes this poor thematic development even more strange is how well they developed the secondary theme. A key argument made by this movie is that abusers might be complicated and multifaceted people, but that doesn't mean they deserve to be forgiven for their abuse. And the way they depict Ryle does an excellent job at exploring this. Ryle Kincaid is a surgeon who has dedicated his life to saving other people. He is by all accounts a great brother and may even become a great dad, but none of that can ever change what he did to his partner. My favorite scene in this movie is when Lily finally tells Alyssa what her brother has done to her. At the end of their conversation, Alyssa explains that as Ryle's sister,
I wish more than anything that you could find a way to forgive him.
but as her best friend,
Lily, if you take him back, I will never speak to you again.
She is acknowledging the good in her brother, but still holding him accountable and supporting her best friend above everything else, just like the audience should. So, if they were able to explore this topic with such nuance, why then couldn't the same be done for the main character and her narrative? We all know that there was a lot of behind-the-scenes drama, so I can't say who is responsible for how each character was handled, but it winds up feeling like the movie cares more about the man who becomes the antagonist rather than the female main character. And because the movie fails to establish its central themes early on, the domestic violence in this movie feels more like added shock value rather than a nuanced part of the narrative. The final element that is needed for a good misdirection is satisfying narrative payoff. Theoretically, a big reveal within a narrative should add to a story and recontextualize things in a meaningful way. A good example of this is the original Scream. When it's revealed that Ghostface is not one person, but rather two, you rethink everything you saw up until that point. Suddenly, parts that didn't make sense do, and it makes future rewatches more engaging because you can see how the killers were working in tandem. In my opinion, a bad example is Saltburn. Initially, the movie seems to be about Oliver's desperate attempt to befriend the rich and charismatic Felix and gain the acceptance of his family. But in the last 7 minutes, they reveal that Oliver was a psychopath from the very beginning, and that he always intended to steal Saltburn from Felix and his family. This is definitely a big recontextualization, but it winds up taking away from the movie rather than adding to it. What was a dark and nuanced character study is suddenly a cartoonishly over-the-top thriller with a mustache-twirling villain. Unfortunately, It Ends With Us has a similar problem when it comes to its recontextualization. Aside from the flashbacks, the entire first half of the movie is dedicated to Lily and Ryle falling in love. On first viewing, you want to see them get together and you're excited about their romance. But once we find out that Ryle is abusive, all those scenes retroactively turn sour. If we explored the idea that Lily doesn't think she'd ever fall for or stay with an abusive partner, we'd view the first half of the movie like a tragedy, wherein the belief would be what causes her to overlook the initial red flags. But once again, they don't do this. So now these scenes just feel, well, icky. One of the major criticisms of Colleen Hoover's novel is that it arguably romanticizes an abusive relationship, and with how the movie adapted these early scenes, that criticism feels more poignant than ever. I think the movie could have at least focused on how the parts that made their romance exciting are also what made it toxic. A common phenomenon in abusive relationships is that partners get addicted to the adrenaline that comes with extreme emotions. The fighting is extremely bad, but the relationship is full of intense affection when things are good. The one scene that does this effectively is when Ryle gets into a fight with Atlas. His emotions are obviously running high when he gets violent, but then when he storms off, he also gets incredibly vulnerable. He admits to Lily that he's never cared about anyone as much as her.
You've never been here before. You have me. You have all of me.
I know.
And hints at the fact that he's scared she'll leave him.
I
So
know.
if I'm not what you want,
No,
you just...
no, I'm fine.
In turn, Lily is desperate to reassure him and is equally afraid of losing him. The same adrenaline that drove them apart is also present when they're coming back together. It's a toxic cycle that blurs the line between possessiveness and dedication, between being jealous and being protective. It's by no means a good thing, but it clearly demonstrates why they cling to each other so desperately. Unfortunately, this sequence takes place after the midpoint, and they really needed to include more of this dynamic in the first half. Speaking of the restaurant sequence, it's another example of a recontextualization that makes things objectively worse. On first viewing, the audience is meant to believe that Ryle hurting Lily was an accident. Additionally, the audience knows that Atlas is incredibly sensitive to domestic violence. Because of this, when Ryle and Lily show up with their injuries, the audience feels immediate tension because they know what Atlas is going to think. When you first watch it, this scene is incredibly engaging because we know exactly what it looks like. But theoretically, this is the one time that it's not what it looks like. It's so tough to watch because you understand why Atlas gets so protective, and you understand why Ryle is confused and jealous, and you also understand that the two of them fighting is probably triggering for Lily, and it's all because of a big misunderstanding. Except, once the movie reveals that Ryle actually is abusive, the scene no longer has any tension. It just makes it so that it was what it looked like all along. So then why why did we spend so much time on this scene? On a rewatch, this sequence doesn't add anything meaningful. I think it would have been at least a little better if Atlas was almost able to get through to her, but she's still in denial and doesn't believe him. If we see her start to replay the events in her head, but stop because she doesn't like what she might see, this sequence would still have an impact on the narrative even after you know the twist. Compare this then to Glass Onion. Once you know that Andy is Helen, or that Miles is the killer, you can go back and watch the first half to see how all the pieces fit into place. You now understand why people thought Andy was acting strange, and why Miles was surprised to see her. You can see where Miles kept the red note, and you can hear when he stops Duke from ruining his alibi.
Remember that night you almost pancaked me with it on the road outside of
Anderson Cooper's birthday.
I was pretty meh on Glass Onion the first time I watched it, but the twist recontextualized things in such a way that it's now one of my favorite movies in the genre. Every time I go back to watch it, I catch more and more important details. Some of the early scenes might still feel slow and meandering, but they never feel hollow, because the twist adds more to the movie than it takes away. And ultimately, that's why I'm so upset with how It Ends With Us handled its big reveal. Using domestic violence as a plot twist isn't inherently insensitive, but when it's done so without meaning or purpose, I have to wonder why the filmmakers chose to make this movie. Some of these issues come straight from the book itself, but why not improve those elements in the adaptation? Or, at the very least, capitalize on the strengths of film as a medium. Like I said, I'm okay with a movie lying to its audience, but there has to be a good reason. In its current state, it feels like it lies for the sake of marketing and shock value, rather than enhancing the film's narrative, which, in my opinion, is more of a betrayal than a misdirection. If you like this video and want to see another discussion of book-to-screen adaptations, check out my video on The Hunger Games. I'm Dylan, and this has been The Writer's Block.